Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Can everyone see my screen okay and hear my video? Or I mean, hear my sound okay? Cool, thank you. Always want to double check. I don't want to assume you guys can see it and then you'd be like, wait, can't see anything. Okay, it is now 2 o'clock. So, hi everyone. I hope you had a nice weekend. And if you celebrate Easter or Passover, I hope even despite all this social distancing, you were able to enjoy the holiday. I personally worked, as is grad life, but hopefully you guys got to have more fun than I did. So today we're going to talk about first language acquisition. And I think this topic is really fun. It's pretty far from the work that Carrie and I do. We focus on when people have an acquired language and they lose it. But today we'll be talking about when people don't have a language and they acquire one. So pretty fun stuff. So to start this off, I just wanted to have you guys think about a question, and that question is, how do you think children acquire language? So just in general, if you guys want to put in the chat or someone wants to unmute their mic, I mean, what are the notions that you guys have for how a child acquires language? I know you can kind of see, I don't know why on my screen, you can kind of see the ideas here, and you can use those ideas if you'd like, but what do you really think drives children learning language? Molly says hearing it. Good. Emily says from being exposed to language from those around them. Good. Environment. Nice. You guys sound like you are in the field of speech and hearing sciences. Very good. So some of the notions for how children acquire language, these are just like, if you go out into the world, kind of the common things that people tend to think. So they think it's taught to them by their parents. They practice saying things and learn them by being corrected. Or they don't really have to learn language at all. It's just completely innate. Or kind of what you guys are getting at, some combination of these factors. So today's lecture is all about understanding the basic processes of acquiring language. So the goal is for you guys to understand just the different proposals for how language is acquired and the problems with those proposals, and to understand the importance of what's known as the critical period for language acquisition. Some of you might have learned about this, so if you have, then we'll be revisiting it today. And I hope you can list and describe the stages of language development And the goal for this is mainly just to understand those stages of development. So it's not about really rote memorization, but just really understanding what those stages are indicating. And then we'll also define mean length of utterance. And then that last bullet point, I actually meant to delete that and never did. So you can ignore that. Whoops, my bad. So when we talk about language acquisition, what's so fascinating about it is that most children acquire all of the subsystems of language. So we're talking about all these component pieces you learned about in the first half of the class, like phonology, lexicon, syntax, pragmatics, and they do it all quickly and seemingly effortlessly. So the question is, how do all of these systems get there? And we want to know, does it have something to do with innate skill? Are our parents teaching it to us? Are we imitating it? So as you guys, in the field of language science know, there are many theories about how this actually happens. So I think with most of the information in the second half of the class I'll present to you, we're going to say, these are some of the theories, but there's other theories. And as always, there are some problems with these theories. So let's just briefly look at the ideas that I kind of mentioned on the first slide, and then we'll look at some of the kind of possible problems with these. So let's start with parents actively teach language. So let's look at this example. In this example, the child says, "Mama isn't boy, he a girl." And the mom says, "That's right." So you see, this is, an ungrammatical sentence here, yet the parent here doesn't correct the grammar. They just kind of correct or they don't even correct anything, I guess. They're just saying like, "Yeah, you're totally right about that." And then in this one here, this example, the child says, "And Walt Disney comes on Tuesday." And the mom says, "No, he does not." And again, in this example, this is the child's speech is perfectly grammatical, but again, the mom's more focused on the meaning behind what was said. So it really seems that when children are interacting with people in their environment, they tend to be focused on the concept, like the broader concept, rather than grammar itself. And we also see this when we look at parent-child interactions with something known as child-directed speech. So in this example here, the mom says to the child, "Are you sleepy?" And the child says, "Yeah." And the mom says, "Okay, go potty, put your jammies on." And the child says, "Okay, go night-night." And the mom's like, "Yeah, you go night-night." And so when you see this, this is pretty common speech between a parent and a child, or a caretaker and a child. But you see that, this isn't correct speech. I wouldn't go to my husband at night and say, "Hey, I got to go potty," and then go night night. Like, that's not how we speak. So if we are to say that children are taught language, then, parents aren't doing a very good job of teaching them language, because with this child-directed speech, it uses very short sentences, and especially when you're a long-winded individual like myself, I don't use very short sentences. The vocabulary is very restricted to the things that the child is used to talking about in their everyday life. So, they talk about going night-night and being tired and putting their jammies on probably every night. And then you also see these diminutive forms where, like, jammies, so that's like, kind of making things smaller and cute. Instead of saying pajamas, you say jammies, or instead of saying dog, you say doggy. So they use a lot of that diminutive form. And there's a lot of repetition. So when I talk to a friend, the friend doesn't constantly repeat what I say so that I can make sure, there's mutual understanding. Instead, the conversation just goes on rapidly. So again, if we're saying that children are taught language, then it's not very explicit, the teaching. So another example of this comes from Nicaraguan Sign Language and also from Creole languages, where we see that rather than children being taught the language, they're actually the ones that are teaching and kind of allowing the language to emerge. So I linked 2 videos here. I'm just gonna play a little bit of this first one if you guys aren't familiar with Nicaraguan Sign Language. It's really fascinating. But then when you guys are at home or studying whatever, there's a ton of videos on YouTube, so you can look at those. So let me just switch over to my video screen real quick. And as soon as I figure out how to do that, it's always so complicated. Okay, switch this screen. I'll just talk to myself the whole time. Okay. So let me know in the chat if you guys can't see the screen or can't hear the video, but this is the video on Nicaraguan Sign Language.
For a deaf child entering the community today, it's a completely different experience. That first generation, they were languageless and they had to figure out on their own how to communicate with each other. And yet a child today, there's a full developed language around them that they can learn immediately. My research focuses on a new sign language that's been emerging in Nicaragua within the deaf community there. It started in the 1970s. Over the course of the last 40 years, the language has blossomed and grown and emerged. For a scientist like myself, this is an unprecedented opportunity. It's the only case that we know of a language that's been documented while its originators are still alive. I've been documenting this language since 1990. I go down in the summers and I'll bring a small research team with me, including some Barnard students, and we'll videotape different people in the community in a way that lets us capture how the language changed over time. We bring that video back, and analyzing this video is kind of like code breaking. We're trying to figure out what the regularities are. I look at every generation of the language as it got passed down to new waves of children each year. What we've learned by studying the emergence of this particular language is that all languages come from the same place, and that's from child learners. That children have a special capacity not just to learn language well, but to create and organize and change language over time. Barnard has provided opportunities for students to be able to work with me. For example, I've had some students do Summer Research Institute fellowships or independent studies, and this makes it possible for me to build a research team where they're not just learning from me, but they're also mentoring each other. As long as
Sorry if you hear that jet flying overhead right now. Hopefully it's not too distracting for you. I'm just gonna switch back over to my screen. Okay. So were a lot of you familiar with Nicaraguan Sign Language from other classes or Googling things? So some of you have learned about it from like deaf studies classes. Yeah, so yep, a lot of you have said that you've learned about it. I said a lot, there's 2 of you that said yes, but it's a lot. So this language is really fascinating because in Nicaragua, there was this population of individuals who were deaf and they didn't have any like dedicated school, but they're, I can't remember which year it happened, but through some series of actions, the government came together and opened this school for deaf children. And so many of these children prior to being in this school only had what was known as home sign. So they developed like kind of rudimentary communication systems to be able to get through like everyday life with their family members. But home sign is a little like less systematic and stuff than regular sign languages. So what happened when all these children came together is they started forming a system of communication, and it was brought from all of their different versions of home sign. And then over the generations, the children, as new children would come into the school, would pass their sign language down to those children. And at this point, I can't remember the year, but at this point, it's now basically an established language. So when they were first documenting it, it was considered an emerging language. And I don't know if it's transitioned from an emerging language to just being called a language at this point. But basically, through children, this language was created. And you also often see that with Creoles as well. So languages, when you come in close contact with other speakers of other languages, and then you start to kind of blend those together, usually that's passed on from younger generations to the next generation, not older. So looking at whether children are taught language, the problems with saying that is how children learn language are these things that I just demonstrated for you. So kids don't usually get feedback on the correctness of their grammar. They only tend to get feedback on just kind of like the truthfulness of their utterances, or like the completeness of it, but it's not usually explicit grammar correction. And infant and child-directed speech is just not how we really talk. So it's great, I guess, for helping children learn language, and there's a whole section in your book on it and what it does, but it doesn't really mirror the speech that we want them to get to. And then finally, grammatical languages like Creoles and Nicaraguan Sign Language tend to develop from very impoverished input. So they go from systems with basically no like syntax and stuff in place to very elaborate systematic languages. So it's not to say when I list these problems that there's no element of teaching a language. That wouldn't be true, but that's just not the only way in which children acquire a language.
I love my father.
Oops, I think someone has their mic.
I do, he's my father. Even if I didn't, I have to love him.
Even if what? There you go. I think I can delete it or mute it. I thought that was a video for a second. Okay, and so now we're gonna move on to this next one. Kids just imitate the language that they hear. So let's look at what this is like, and then we'll talk about some of the problems with saying that kids imitate language. So in this example, the child says, "Want other one spoon, Daddy?" The father says, "You mean you want the other spoon?" Child says, "Yes, I want other spoon, please, Daddy." The father says, "Can you say the other spoon?" Child says, "Other one spoon." Then father, say other, child, other, father, spoon, child, spoon, father, other spoon, child, other spoon. Now give me other one spoon. So what this illustrates is that despite this very explicit, overt correction of how the child is saying other spoon, once the child is done being very explicitly corrected, they go right back to how they say it. So typically we say that kids kind of systematically reject corrections of speech because like single corrections are not what causes them to, really get that into their language system. So, if we try to get the child to imitate us, they'll imitate us maybe within that moment, but then the next time we ask them, they'll go back to saying it how they say it until it's really like solidified in their language. There's also this really famous experiment from Berko Gleason's lab, and some of you guys might be familiar with this image but not have known where it comes from. So this is the experiment where the wug comes from, very famous linguistic feature. And in this experiment, Berko Gleason would show children images and then ask them and give them a sentence, and then they would ask them to fill in the sentence with the correct form of the word. So child would see, "This is a wug." And then they would see, "Now there is another one. There are two of them. There are two." And what should the child say right here? Thank you. 2 wugs. So the child then supplies the plural form here. In this one, I don't know, I think this was the same experiment. I can't remember for sure, but from Berko Gleason's lab. There was also ones where they said, this is a man who knows how to nose. He is nosing every day. He does it every day. Every day he noses. Good. And then this is a man who knows how to rick. He is ricking. He did the same thing yesterday. What did he do yesterday? Good. You guys are masters of English. Good job. So he ricked. So this shows that children, if they could only imitate what they heard previously, then they wouldn't be able to extend their rules to new words and phrases that they've never heard before. So prior to this, unless their parent was a linguist, they should have never heard this word wug, but they were able to provide the plural here, the third person singular here, and the past tense in this example. So that really shows that children go beyond imitating language. So some of the problems just identified, but just to reiterate, is that kids produce sentences that they've never heard. So if you ever hang out with a kid, nieces, nephews, your own kid, friends' kids, they say some pretty wild and funny things, and it's pretty safe to assume that they've never heard that before. So if they were just imitating, they wouldn't be able to do that. Also, as you saw, kids systematically reject corrections. So even if you say to the kid pajamas, they'll say jamamas or jammies or whatever. They won't correct it right away. And then, we've all probably heard kids put the ed on irregular verbs for past tense, like putted for put, and that's, they should have never heard the word putted. Unless it was from maybe a friend or something, but despite being told, no, the verb is put, you don't put it, you put it, they'll still go back to saying put it. And again, you saw from this Berko Gleason experiment that they apply the rules of language to new words. So they can use what they already know about a language, hear a word, and then apply the correct plural S sound to it. And then finally, just kind of from a logistic perspective, if they were to sit there and have to learn every single sentence that ever was uttered to them, then that would just be insane. That's not how language works. So when we were talking about language processing, and we were saying with words how it's more efficient to store phonemes than to store the entire word, the same idea there applies. It's more efficient to know the component pieces of language, so know morphology, know phonology, know how syntax works, and then fill in those slots with the words that you want to say, rather than remembering entire sentences, entire utterances. Pretty intuitive stuff. So finally, let's look at the last thing here. Children don't learn language. Language is innate. So this one is probably one of the biggest, I would say, things studied in language acquisition for children. So let's look a little bit at that. So the best way to study whether children are innately capable of comprehending and producing language on their own is to really study children who are deprived of normal language environments. So obviously in the research setting, that would be highly unethical to deprive a child of language input. So that can't be done. But there are unfortunately these extreme cases of isolated or feral children that have provided a lot of insight into the innateness of language. And based on these children, the critical period hypothesis for language acquisition was developed. So this theory states that humans have a predisposition for language acquisition that begins to, anticlimactic, that begins to dissipate around the age of puberty. So they say puberty, I guess we could say, is like 10, 11, 12, I don't know. But when we say puberty, we're really talking like 7 or 8. And it falls off dramatically at the onset of adulthood. And so let's look at this through the lens of feral children. So there's all these cases of feral children, and I'm going to show you a few examples of these children and their language capabilities. But you can Google a lot of these people, like Oksana Malaya, who I won't be talking about. I actually linked a YouTube video for her. She was a child who was raised with dogs, and I don't think she was discovered till I think it was like 10 or 11 or something. I can't totally remember, but it's really fascinating stuff. So if you guys want to watch a video on that, you can. But let's start by looking at this example of Isabel. So Isabel was brought to researchers' attention around 6.5 years old. And the reason that she didn't have language because she was born to a deaf mother who couldn't speak and who was in kind of an abusive household. And so she had very limited linguistic input. And I think the mother ended up escaping. And then at that point, researchers and police officers found her. And when she was found, she could only produce kind of this like strange croaking sound with her vocal tract. But fascinatingly, within 2 years, Isabel learned to speak at the level of her 8.5-year-old peers. So she was found at 6.5, and within the span of 2 years, she was at the same level of her peers. So pretty fascinating stuff. So let's look at some of her example utterances at 8.5 years old. So by 8.5 years old, she could say, "Why does paste come out if one upsets the jar?" She was British. And what does Miss Mason say when you told her I cleaned my classroom? So pretty good speech for someone who had no linguistic input until 6.5. So this really suggests that if treatment occurs within that critical period of time, you can really actually regain your language skills, or not even regain, I just acquire language, despite having, these very impoverished backgrounds. But let's look at an example of a child who is found a little bit older than Isabel. So Jeannie, she's probably one of the most famous of these cases. She was actually found in California at 13 years old. And she was in it's a really sad story. She was in a very abusive house and was locked up and tied to a chair in a dark room for most of her life. And if she ever spoke, she would be beaten. And so she really learned to not make any sounds. And she was found by, I think, police officers when her mom, who had cataracts and could no longer see, was able to also escape the household. And she ended up being put into the custody of some police officers and researchers, and they really used this case to figure out if language was innate or not. So this was actually research that was being done at UCLA, so it was just like 2 hours north of here. Pretty crazy stuff. And after language intervention, Jeannie was able to acquire some language. She had a large vocabulary and was very interested in learning the words for a lot of stuff. And so she, in one of the videos, she would kind of be like looking at something and wanting to know what the word was for it. So she was very interested in learning language. And she was able to get kind of like perceptual vocabulary words, but also was able to nail down some of these like abstract and concrete terms that are a little bit harder to acquire. But her syntax and her morphology never fully developed. So let's look at that. So some of her example utterances are Mike paint, applesauce by store, Jeannie have mommy have baby, grow up, I like elephant, eat peanut. So from these, you can understand what she's saying, and you can see she has a decent range of vocabulary, but she's really lacking that grammatical structure here. So she tends to omit those closed class words like auxiliary verbs and pronouns, prepositions, not pronouns, prepositions, things like that. So one of the things that this researcher at UCLA, Susan Curtis, said is that Jeannie was really good at stringing together these content words. And it was, had rich and clear meaning, but it just really lacked grammatical structure. So despite all that long and hard work by linguists and psychologists intervening, Jeannie's language skills never really reached adult levels. So what you can see from this is, unlike Isabel, Jeannie was a little bit older and her language never got there, whereas Isabel at 6 years old was able to acquire both vocabulary and syntax and morphology. Now let's look at one more extreme example. So Chelsea was found in 1989, and she was born in this rural town in Northern California. Apparently a lot of this stuff happens in California. It's weird how many examples are in California. But she had some pretty inept doctors and clinicians who diagnosed her as being developmentally delayed rather than recognizing that she was deaf. So she grew up in a very isolated, languageless environment, but otherwise she was perfectly emotionally and neurologically normal. And so it wasn't until the age of 31 years old that she was able to be fit with hearing aids and was put into intensive therapy for language. So after years and years of intensive therapy, she only ever got to a 10-year-old level of cognitive intelligence. She only had 2,000 words, but she was able to get a job and read and write and be independent. It's just her language was severely impacted by learning it so late. So let's look at some of her utterances. Some of the things that she would say are things like, the boat sits water on, the small A the hat, orange Tim car in, banana the eat, breakfast eating girl, combining hair the boy. So some of the things you might notice in this is her word order is totally off. She has no systematic word order. Sometimes she uses determiners, sometimes she doesn't. Her verbs tend to be in the wrong form. So pretty severe language deficits there. So all of these cases I just showed you provided a lot of support for the critical period hypothesis. So each of these cases increased in age and when they ended up acquiring language, and each one was more and more severely impacted in their language abilities. So this suggested that those who were exposed to language after the critical period really seemed to be unable to acquire many of those syntactic components of grammar. So they could get some of the vocabulary, as I mentioned, but really these syntactic components were severely affected. And currently, a lot of this stuff with Jeannie, and that was in the 70s and 80s. So currently we know that age of acquisition and environment are really crucial for determining success with language. So you could be exposed to language within the critical period, but if you're not in a very language-rich environment, your language could be really impacted. And if you don't learn it until after that critical period, so after 7, 8, 9, around then, you're really going to have a difficult time acquiring the morphosyntactic aspects of language. And that is, we'll talk about bilingualism, but that's really kind of the driving force for why it is so hard to learn a second language later in life. It's the theories say it's because that critical period for language acquisition has closed. Okay, any questions on that? Make sure I'm scrolled down. Okay. All right, so how do kids acquire language if it's not just through teaching or imitation or complete innateness of language? So again, there's many theories. I didn't have you read about all of those in your book, but we're just gonna talk about this very prominent and widely supported theory known as active construction of a grammar. So active construction of a grammar says that children come to understand the rules of grammar and language on their own. So what's innate about language is their ability to develop the rules and kind of parse out and recognize the rules of language as they receive input. But it's critical that they get that input in order to do that. So we're uniquely built to analyze the speech stream, but if I don't have any speech to analyze, then I'm not going to be successful with language. And so again, with bilingualism, that's a lot of what you see, where if you're learning a second language, you have to get a lot of input of that second language. So you can't just go to a classroom 2 hours a week and speak German for a little bit and go home and be an expert. You'd have to go to Germany and immerse yourself in German and really be in a situation where you get a lot of input in order to learn. So some examples of active construction of grammar would be the acquisition of the past tense morpheme ed. So what usually happens when children acquire this past tense morpheme is at first they'll overgeneralize the use of the past tense. So as they're hearing speech, they'll hear that when people are talking about events in the past, they put this ed morpheme on. And so then whenever they want to talk about anything in the past, they'll start adding this ed morpheme. So played, jumped, listened. But then when they get to these irregular plurals, past tense words like go and sing, they'll apply that ed morpheme to those as well. So goed, singed, wented, putted. And so that's very typical of child language, but to hear that. But eventually they will work their system will work that all out, and they'll use the correct irregular past tense form and the correct ed past tense form. But it's really a matter of getting this input, learning what the systematic patterns are, testing those patterns, maybe over testing those patterns, and then working that all out in your language. And so that's what people in support of active construction of a grammar say is really happening when you're acquiring language. And within this framework is something known as statistical learning. So statistical learning is the use of statistical regularities in language. So like the co-occurrence of certain phonemes together, certain morphemes together to acquire that language. So here we're talking about grammar, but statistical learning has been applied to kind of all aspects of language. So grammar, phonemes, word boundaries, syntax, all of that. So this statistical learning stuff is very famous work by Jenny Safran, Janet Worker, Katie Graf Estes, if you guys have heard of those people. So let's look at a really famous case of how statistical learning works. So I'm going to show you a study of infants first between 6 and 8 months old, and then between 10 and 12 months old. So this was a study done by Patricia Kuhl. She's really big in the infant language acquisition realm. And she had children who spoke different languages come into her lab, and she did this phoneme discrimination task where children would hear 2 phonemes that are specific to Mandarin, and they would have to do a discrimination where the baby would show that they can really hear the difference between these 2 phonemes. So let's look at that. So at 6 to 8 months, babies, American babies in blue, and Taiwanese babies, speakers of Chinese, are in orange. And at 6 to 8 months, babies perform very similar on this phoneme discrimination task, so differentiating between these two sounds. But then when they're tested again at 10 to 12 months, Taiwanese babies who are still getting, this Mandarin input are much better than American babies who are not receiving constant Mandarin input on this phoneme discrimination task. So it seems that between 6 to 8 months and 10 to 12 months, babies are really working out the sounds that they're hearing in their language, and they're realizing what sounds are important and what sounds are not important for their language. So for Mandarin, these sounds are very important to distinguish, but for English, we don't need to distinguish these sounds in our language. So then they did another task where they just had more English-speaking babies come in and do this task. And unlike the babies at the 6 to 8 month period who were exposed to Taiwanese or to Mandarin and English, these babies represented by this blue triangle have only ever been exposed to English. And so they just used this as a control group to make sure that it was nothing about, going into that lab or nothing about how that lab was set up that was causing this decline in phoneme discrimination. And that's what they found is, there's nothing special about their lab that's causing babies to be able to discriminate these sounds. So that's all that's showing. It's just a control group. And then in this graph here, what they did is after they saw that at 10 to 12 months, babies who were not exposed to Mandarin performed poorly on this discrimination task. They did at this blue line here, they did an intervention where they exposed babies to Mandarin for 12 weeks again. So they would come into the lab for a certain amount of hours, and a lab assistant in Patricia Kuhl's lab would play with the babies in Mandarin. She would really emphasize different sounds in the language. And after that 12-week intervention, the English-speaking babies, again in this orange triangle, performed the same as the Taiwanese babies. So what this showed is that with exposure to language, with that input, babies are really processing that speech stream, learning what matters, learning what's important for understanding what people are saying to them. And they're using that to kind of put into their mind and their mental sound bank of what sounds they need to learn. And they're holding that there. And then finally, this is just a really interesting facet of this research to show that it really has to do with the environment and the type of input that babies are getting. They also exposed, instead of doing the 12-week intervention in person with a baby, they took another group of babies and they did the same intervention, but they just, instead of doing it face-to-face, they had the babies watch it on TV. So in one case, the baby would see the experimenter on a TV and the experimenter would be talking and yay, everything's great. And then in another case, the baby would just hear the audio of the lab assistant speaking Mandarin. So one would get audio visual and then the other one would just be audio. And what they found is that when it wasn't in-person interaction with the baby no longer performed at the Mandarin level after the intervention. So the babies perform back down here as if they have never heard Mandarin before. So again, just to reiterate, what this all really illustrates is that babies are just experts at taking the input that they're hearing and translating that to the meaningful units within their language. And this is all part of that like statistical learning. Like it's very calculated. It's based on frequency and co-occurrence and those kind of things. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about statistical learning. And again, this is kind of the more dominant theory out there for how children are actually acquiring language. So any questions on language acquisition in terms of the theories for it so far? Okay, doesn't look like there's any questions. So we'll spend the rest of the lecture looking at the stages for language development. So we'll look at the pre-linguistic stage, and then we'll go into babbling, single words, two words, and then what's known as telegraphic speech. So in the pre-linguistic stage, babies, they're really born ready to attend to language. And before they start actually producing anything that's resembling language, they're already doing a ton of work to prepare themselves for language. So early on, they have to figure out which sounds they're hearing. They have to figure out how to discriminate them. They have to figure out how to segment the speech stream when they're getting all of this input. They have to figure out different patterns in their language. And, probably most importantly, they have to be super cute when they're doing it. So a lot of work on these little baby shoulders. So going into the more linguistic stages. So I think your book has some nice charts for, kind of finer grain detail of these stages, but we'll look at kind of the bigger stages that start to be really recognizable as you watch a kid acquire language. So going into the babbling stage, babbling is kind of considered the first stage within language acquisition, where babies are really trying to uncover the units of language. So at this stage, they're really trying to figure out like the differences between non-speech sounds and speech sounds. And when they do this, they generally start with what's known as canonical babbling. So that's this mama, 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 where each syllable, it's usually a consonant vowel syllable, and it's just repeated over and over and over. And then as they get a little bit older, they move to what's known as variegated babbling, where you see that now they have different phonemes in the syllables, and it's still very like C, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, but it doesn't have that same repetition as the canonical babbling. And this is where they start really testing out more sounds in the language, but at this point, it's still all the sounds in language that are possible. So it's not quite specific to their native language, but they start to move towards the sounds, producing the sounds of their native language in the babbling stage. But one interesting thing is that babbling is not a prerequisite for learning language. So there's cases where babies are prevented from babbling because due to like medical conditions, they'll have to have like pipes put into their trachea, and this really prevents them from being able to babble. But as soon as those those tubes are removed, the child is able to immediately start babbling at the stage that they are supposed to be babbling at. And so babbling is really interesting because it's, I saw there's a bunch of questions in there. It seems to be more to do with like the maturation of the brain rather than specific language, just like language processes. So if, like I said, if a baby babbles, isn't able to babble and then has a tube removed, they're able to babble at like the same level as their peers. And it's just because of how the brain is developing. So it's very like motor. My husband always refers to it as like fine tuning your motor skills. So when my little nephew makes a lot of like sounds, he's like, oh, just fine tuning your motor skills there. So that's really what babbling is allowing them to do. Just want to look at this question to make sure. Okay, cool. Yeah, can you repeat the name of the second babbling stage? So canonical and variegated. Thank you guys for helping out with that. So there's this really interesting distinction between babbling in hearing babies and babbling in babies who are born deaf. And I'm not going to play the videos for you, but I did link 2 videos where you can see the difference in babbling. But hearing babies around 6 months old begin to produce a large variety of sounds. It's from, all possible sounds in human language, and it starts to kind of take on those intonation contours of the language that they hear in the environment. But despite not being able to make as many vocal utterances, babies who are deaf will also babble, but they babble using their hands. And so if they do make any vocalizations, they're usually really like random and unsystematic, whereas you saw with the 2 babbling examples, those are very like systematic and they follow a stage. But babies who are deaf, they will do the same thing just with their hands. So they'll start with very canonical hand babbling. So like they'll do like ma, 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 ma. And I don't know if this is ma, this is just me moving my hands, but if any of you can sign, maybe you can correct me. But they'll do very repetitive sign motions. And then as they develop a little more, you'll see changes in those like syllables. So changes in those signs from like ma to, something where it's very like clearly changing. If there's, would they still? So the question from Terry was, would deaf babies only hand babble if they're exposed to sign language, or would they still do this even if they weren't exposed to language? So I don't know for sure, but a lot of research has suggested that babbling is, again, like a maturational thing. So it's just kind of like characteristic of beginning to produce language. But I imagine that if you lacked any kind of input, your babbling would be very, very limited. So it is based a lot on like starting to use those articulatory muscles, whether it's the mouth or the hands. But I think without exposure to language, it would end up being pretty limited. So not totally sure about that, but that's a really good question. Okay, so moving to the single word stage, this happens around 12 months of age. And this is where babies begin to segment the continuous speech stream and pick out like individual words and use them. So often what happens is these single words that they are known as holophrastic. And that's where that single word expresses an entire meaning. So an example of this is, you'll hear a lot of children say up, and that means pick me up, or I want to be up, or I'm scared, or something like that. Oftentimes they'll point to an animal, like they'll say dog or truck or whatever it is, and they use that single word to say like, there is a dog over there, I like dogs. So these single words end up expressing whole sentences and whole messages. In the single word stage, phonology is really simplified. So it's usually just single syllables. And like you saw with the babbling at the single word stage, it's still kind of those like consonant vowel patterns for the most part. So examples again are that like up, where it's just a CV, single syllable utterance. For dog, they will often just say in this stage, they'll just say da. Or you probably think of a lot of words like this where they just kind of say like the beginning or just part of the word. And they usually stick to phonemes that are more frequently in the world's languages. So sounds like ba, ma, da, ka are very common. And that's why you hear a lot of times like children pretty early on will say mama, da, da. And that's just because, I mean, one, the parents are probably in their face constantly saying mama, da, da. But it's also these phonemes are a lot easier for children to produce. So they'll kind of, in the single word stage as well, stick to the easier phonemes. And infrequent phonemes like th, they'll try to avoid. So a lot of times, like you'll hear a kid instead of that or the, they'll say da, da. So they'll kind of substitute more frequent phonemes in place of these harder phonemes to produce. And I saw, oh no, I already answered that question. Okay. So moving to the two-word stage, around 2 years old, children start to put words together. Very exciting for parents or aunts like myself. So in this stage, babies will start to say, or I guess toddlers at this point, will start to say things like mommy sock, doggy floor, push truck. And what you'll notice from these examples is that they're really lacking in those like morphological markers, so those inflectional morphemes. But they are using a variety of grammatical relationships between the two words. So here, this should be mommy's sock to represent a possessive relationship, but you don't see that possessive S marker here. Here it should be like doggy is on the floor, but they drop that auxiliary verb there. And so you see that there's these different relationships, but they're really lacking in morphological content. It's pretty common for babies in this stage. And then finally, moving to telegraphic speech. With telegraphic speech, this happens when utterances are longer than 2 words. So it's called telegraphic speech because, like in the 2-word utterances, you're really missing those functional words like a telegram. So let's look at that. So that's when children say things like, what that? He played little car. Andrew want that? No, sit there. So, well, for the most part, these are longer than 2 words, but they're dropping the kind of function or those like inflectional morphemes in this stage. And this always reminds me, if you guys are Office fans, it always reminds me of when Kevin says, why waste time say lot word when few word do trick? And in this, he's dropping a lot of those like function words and, drops determiners, prepositions, those type of things here. So you can think of the telegraphic stage as Kevin from The Office, dropping a lot of those important words, but using more than 2 words. Interestingly, telegraphic speech conforms to word order. So if it's a child who speaks English, they'll follow subject, verb, object in English, or if they speak Japanese, they'll do subject, object, verb. But again, they won't get those inflectional and function words until different stages. Peter likes the Kevin example, me too. Yeah, so let's see. So despite having really telegraphic speech, we know that children end up acquiring these like inflectional morphemes and these function words with a very consistent pattern. So I put that how these are acquired on the slide for you. You don't have to remember that like present progressive is typically first, then we have prepositions, then they learn plurals. But what I want you to understand is that as they are acquiring these morphological items, they're doing it in a pretty predictable manner. And they also do this when they're acquiring like the use of negatives in a sentence and the use of interrogative. So forming negative sentences, forming questions, they'll do that. Children will do that in a very like consistent pattern. And so just want to talk a little bit about mean length of utterance. Some of you might have heard this, but in the telegraphic stage, you no longer you're moving into like those 3, 4, 5 word utterances. And so once you're in that stage, chronological age is no longer a great indicator of language development beyond those 2 words. So at that point, researchers and clinicians tend to measure language development by the mean length of an utterance. So when we talk about mean length of utterance, or MLU, we're actually concerned with the number of morphemes in an utterance rather than the number of words. So looking at this example here, you see doggy, eat, cookie. So in doggy, eat, cookie, how many morphemes are in that? What do you guys think? You have to remember all the way back to morphology. 3, yeah, good job. So doggy is a morpheme, eat is a morpheme, cookie is a morpheme. And the second one, doggy eating cookie, how many morphemes are in doggy eating cookie? 4, nice job, guys. Way to remember all the way back to morphology. So what you would do here is, if you take this as a child's speech sample, you would take the total number of morphemes, or morphemes in each, and then divide it by the number of utterances. So what that is here you see there's 3, and number 2 you saw there was 4, so that's a total of 7 morphemes in this speech sample. And you would divide that by 2 because you have 2 speech utterances. So we would say that the mean length of utterance in this example is 3.5. And the reason we want to calculate that is because we know that children can be different ages. So one child can be 2 and another child can be 3, but they may be using the same mean length of utterance. So in this phrase here, I said they may be between like 2.3 and 3.5, and despite having, these different ages. So mean length of utterance can really tell us how far along a child is in their language development when we get past that 2-word stage. So looking at that here, whoops, I didn't realize I had the animations on here. I'll just put it all up. We use mean length of utterance coupled with the age to really determine how these things are developing in a child. So around 1 to 2 mean length of utterance, and between 12 to 26 months old, typically you should see like these semantic rules developing. And so it's not, like I said, beyond that 2-word stage, it's not really just about the number of words, it's about the number of morphemes. And that's really important because as you see, children are really good at not using morphemes. So they'll say dog dance instead of like dog is dancing. I don't know why I just came up with that sentence, but apparently the dog is dancing. And so once they start using those morphemes, that's actually like really, really important. And that's kind of a big thing when they're applying those inflectional morphemes. So that's why we start looking more fine grained at mean length of utterance for these children. So any questions on that? If any of you end up working in like child language labs at SDSU, you'll probably be put to work counting the mean length of utterance. So really commonly used in the field. Okay, I forgot to fix my arrows, so bear with me. So now all those examples I showed you had to do with how many words a child uses across development. But you all know from this class that when we speak, we don't only access a word's form, we also access the word's meaning. So let's just talk a little bit about what the acquisition of word meaning looks like. With this, there aren't as clear cut of stages. There's not babbling to 1 word to 2 word, but there are some general like usage errors that can be identified when children are acquiring the semantic features of words. So the first one that's up on the slide is complexive concept. And it has to do with associating different features of an object or a person or a thing with the meaning of a word without there being any real unifying characteristic among those items. So in other words, it has to do with using one word to label multiple things, but on the surface, those things seem like they have nothing in common. But if you look a little deeper, you see that they actually do have something in common that has caused the child to label them with the same word. So kind of hard to understand conceptually, so let's just look at an example. So imagine that a child uses the word ball to describe a ball, an apple, a car, a plane, and a bug. So if there's a bug flying up in the sky and the kid points to it and says bug, that would be this example here. So can you guys come up with any sort of unifying feature that you think would cause the kid to call ball, apple, car, plane, and bug all a ball? Is there anything unifying that you guys see about those features?
Is it that they can all fly through the air?
No, that's actually really good. I didn't think about that. Nice job. The idea is actually that when you look at this broad category, there doesn't really seem to be a whole lot of there's not really a feature that seems to unify them. I made this example up, so I didn't think about flying through the air, but I guess that's actually you could make them all fly through the air. But the idea is that, again, as a whole, there's nothing, but if you look at them from one successive feature to the next, there is actually something that's linking them together that way. So for example, if I showed you a ball and an apple, what would you say the unifying feature is between ball and apple? Similar shape, yeah, so they're both round. Now, if I told you that the car was red, what would you say the unifying feature is between apple and car? Color, red, yeah. And then car to plane, vehicle, transportation, yeah, exactly. And then plane to bug, you could say they both fly. So when you look at the successive connection between them, they actually are connected, but when you look at the overall category, you're like, why is this kid calling a bug a ball? So that's one type. Another type is overextensions. So an overextension has to do with extending a word's meaning beyond its typical use. So what does that look like? If I were to ask you guys with this example, what the unifying feature between shark, a sea star, and a seal is, what would you guys say? What do you guys think that unifying feature is? Yeah, they all live in the ocean. Thank you. So if a kid were to call all of these items here a fish, you can see that there's some feature that unifies them together. So they all seem to live in the sea or whatever it is. So the real difference between complexive concept and overextension is that one, the overextension has this clear unifying feature between them, and a complexive concept does not. So I think it's more common to see overextensions in children, but there are definitely documented cases where this complexive concept comes into play, and you really have to work to figure out why the heck the kid is labeling things in the way that they are. So the last thing here is underextension, which is applying a word to a smaller set of objects than it actually represents. And so an example of this would be considering both apple and orange to belong to the category fruit, but not something like avocado or tomato. So some of us know, not everyone knows, that an avocado and a tomato, they're actually considered fruits. But when you think about fruit, kind of the more like prototypical examples that come to mind are things like apples, strawberries, and oranges. So for a child, they are a lot less likely to consider things like avocados or tomatoes fruits, but they would immediately consider apples and oranges. And I think this example may be like a little bit hard to see because most of us are like, yeah, I probably wouldn't really call an avocado a fruit unless I was like pressed to say whether it was or not. But the idea is that they really only use a like constrained set of words to apply a category to. So this could even be like a cat being a cat, but a tiger or lion not being considered a cat. So you can tell I've been watching Tiger King too much. I went down that rabbit hole. But
Noelle, can I
yeah.
ask a question about the complexive concept?
Yeah,
real
yeah,
quick?
of course.
So it would be reflected in the since it's like the acquisition, it would be like reflected in their speech. Like, could you give an example? Like, would it be if you asked the child like to point at like the ball and then they said bug? Like, would that be an example of it?
I mean,
Like following
yeah.
that just like chain of thought.
Yeah, so if I think of like my little nephew going outside or something, you know, they're really like little kids are really good at like they like to point and kind of label things. And so it would be like, you know, the child going outside and they have this concept of what the word ball means. And then they see something like a bug and they're like, yeah, that falls into that concept. And so they're like, hey, a bug. And they point and they're like, yeah, a bug. Or I mean, hey, a ball. And they point to a bug and call it a ball. So it's like kind of like a labeling error. But when you look at it deeper, which, you know, a parent is probably not likely to do, this is really probably just a researcher being like, how did they come to calling a bug a ball? But, you know, most of the time the parent would just be like, well, that's a ball. And then the kid would slowly start to like readjust what they think that word means, like what that lexical entry actually is. Does that help at all, Marina?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, no problem.
I also have a question.
Yeah.
So is the only difference between overextension and underextension that underextension is the correct, like broader, like classification of that term?
Yeah, so with fruit or avocado and tomato, they are a fruit, but the kid might not label it like that. Whereas like a seal is not a fish and the kid might not know that. And so they just call the seal a fish. So yeah, it really has to do with the correctness of that category. So overextending is using it like incorrectly. Underextending is like, even though it's correct, not being willing to use it like that. Does that make sense, Molly? Okay, cool. All right, so there's just 2 slides for you. Class is just about done. I like to put these poll questions in for you just so you guys can really practice since we don't get that like great interaction anymore. And then the last, I'll come back to this if for those who want to sit on here and try it. But the last slide I just wanted to show you guys was these common language development milestones. So your book has 2 big charts. And again, I'm not super concerned with you knowing like the very fine details of every single stage of language acquisition, but just speaking kind of, I condensed these 2 for you so that you can just kind of look broadly at, you know, what's happening, what are the big changes across development in the infant's life. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about this. So I'll stay around if you guys have any questions. And just a reminder, homework 3 is due on Thursday at 11:59, and quiz 4 opens today after class. And it's going to be based a little bit more on the reading since there was so much detail in the reading. It will kind of like bridge the reading and today's lecture. So I'll stick around, and if you guys have any questions or are trying to work this poll question out for yourself, let me know. I'll stay on here for a couple minutes. Thanks, guys.
Hey, Noelle.
Yeah.
Are you guys gonna post the answers to like the different poll questions you guys have posted, like for when we're gonna study for tests and stuff like that?
So on the when I post the lectures, I do the pre-version, and then the post version has the poll questions with the answers for you guys.
Oh, cool. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, just download those post ones.
Okay, thank you.
So Kendall asked, how do we calculate MLU? I missed it when you were explaining. So I'll just, I think my screen's still sharing. I'll just go over this poll question to explain it. So first, when you're doing MLU, you want to count the morphemes within each utterance, and then you divide by the total number of utterances. So if we were to give you an example like this on the exam, you would go through each instance here. So want cookies, more cookie, kitty sleeping, gone kitty, and count the total number of morphemes for each one. So for want cookies, how many morphemes do you think that is? 3, good. So you have want, cookie, and then plural S. More cookie, we would say is 2, good. Kitty sleeping, 3, and then gone kitty, 2, good. So what you would do here is now you have 3, 2, 3, and 2. So you would add that together, so that's 10, I think, yeah, quick math. And then you would divide by 4 because there's 4 different utterances here. And I think 10 divided by 4, if I remember correctly, yeah, 2.5 there. So that's how you would calculate mean length of utterance. And, you know, it can be a little like more complicated to figure out the utterances, but for the sake of, you know, understanding this concept, we'll make it clear. Like there's this many utterances, how many morphemes, divide that by the number of utterances. Cool. So any other questions for you guys remaining on here? If not, we'll take a quick break and then pop on over to office hours if you have other more detailed questions. All right. Yeah, no problem, Sarah. Okay, then I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen and jump off of here. Hope you guys have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you Thursday.